Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English B. And our objective now for the hour is to answer what really is a fairly simple question. I recommend that you put it in your notes right at the top of your paper. And that's this question. What was the Industrial Revolution and why should I care? When we meet the age of the Romantics and the age of the Victorians, we find ourselves dealing with this term, the Industrial Revolution. And I'm aware that sometimes high school students can have gone through a history class where they heard terms like the Renaissance, like the Industrial Revolution, like the Scientific Enlightenment. And these are terms that maybe we feel comfortable with as we fill out our little worksheets or whatever. But when asked exactly what was the Industrial Revolution, why should I care? And that's kind of the second part of the question, why should I care? They're not always so easy to be able to give an answer. So what I want to do today is I want to introduce you to the concept. The way I'm going to do it is when what has often been referred to in room 303 as the famous shoe factory lecture. Shoe factory lecture. You'll understand what that means as I go through the lecture now. The shoe factory lecture. And my objective here is to try to give some sense of what the Industrial Revolution was, especially in England. You may want to write that down. Especially in England, all right, as we move into these texts that we will call Victorian period texts. Another way to say this for your notes is, when we study a great poet like Alfred Lord Tennyson, we recognize that Tennyson was writing in a time that was heavily influenced by the Industrial Revolution. Well, what was the Industrial Revolution, and why should I care? Well, it's at this point that you can set your pens down, because I don't think you're going to need them for a few minutes. My story here normally is not one so easily forgotten, okay? And I'm going to work through a little kind of fictitious story, and I'm going to ask you to kind of just follow along with the story, and then after I've told you the story, I'm going to come back and we're going to begin to make some observations at the end of the lecture on this Industrial Revolution. Let's call it, I don't know, just to make it easy for ourselves, 1900, all right? So the beginning of the 20th century. We can go earlier if you'd wish and call it 1850. It doesn't matter. And one morning, in a small village outside of London, Mr. Schaeffer there wakes up. And he gets ready to go on his walk to his job at the shoe factory. That's where Mr. Schaeffer works. Mr. Schaeffer has worked at that shoe factory pretty much all his life. He started when he was a little boy, and he works on the shoe factory floor. And he knows basically what his day is going to look like, because his day basically looks the same every day. He goes to the shoe factory where he does work on shoes, doing a very particular kind of job that he's been taught how to do, and guess what? He does it pretty well. His daddy before him worked at the same shoe factory. In fact, are you ready for this? Had the same job. And so Schaeffer, as he was growing up, watched his daddy. He did the exact same thing. So he's done it for a number of years. He gets up, he dresses, he says goodbye to his wife, Miss Barnard, and his 8 children. They have been busy. And off he goes to his shoe factory. Miss Barnard says, have a wonderful day at work. I will take care of your 8 children while you're gone. I will see you at the end of the day. By the way, Mr. Schaeffer will have been working at the shoe factory at the end of his day. He will work close to 15 hours before he comes back home. And then he'll get up and do it the next day after that. He has a serious job. As he comes around the corner towards the shoe factory, he notices something strange for the first time. He hasn't ever seen this before. Outside the door of the shoe factory, a whole bunch of his pals are standing there. He's like, what's going on? And in fact, one of his pals is walking past him the other way. And Schaeffer is almost certain that he saw his eyes were red like he'd been crying. Schaeffer's like, whoa, what is going on? And he asks him. And the guy says, there's a list on a door. I hope your name ain't on it. Schaeffer's going, what are you talking about, list on the door? Like we get raises and they're giving us, no. This list on the door is the guys who don't work at the shoe factory anymore. Schaeffer's like, what are you talking about? No, there's a list on the door of guys who no longer work at the shoe factory. Schaeffer's like, well, my name ain't gonna be on that list. Dude, I've been working at the shoe factory all my life. 50 years at least I've been working at the shoe factory. There ain't no way my name's gonna be on that list. And as he gets up there to the list and he looks on the door of the shoe factory, 2 from the bottom is his name. His name. And he kind of looks around at some of the other guys, and they're like, what's going on? Why isn't everybody's name on his shoe factory? Is it closing? No. Well, why is my name on? No answer. It is significant to point out at this part of my story to say, Schaeffer has absolutely no idea why his name is on the shoe factory list. He ain't got no job anymore. He got no idea why. He only knows one thing, and that is he ain't got no job at a shoe factory anymore. That's all he knows. What I'm going to tell you is the backstory. I'm going to tell you why Schaeffer's name is on the list. Are you ready for this? It ain't got nothing to do with Schaeffer. Zero to do with Schaeffer. 2 weeks before the morning that Schaeffer got up, kissed his wife goodbye and his 8 children and walked off to the shoe factory, 2 weeks before that, the owner of the shoe factory, Mr. Hernandez, was sitting in his office. He was working at what he always works at. Mr. Hernandez owns the shoe factory. Here's the deal about the shoe factory. Mr. Hernandez's great-great-grandpa started the shoe factory. And in fact, right before Mr. Hernandez's grandpa died, he called the young man in and he said, someday, you got the shoe factory. Don't wreck the ambulance. That is to say, don't screw it up. The shoe factory's been in our family for a long time. It's the reason we have our own private parking place at the country club. Don't screw it up. And then Hernandez took it over from his daddy who said, guess what? Same thing. Don't screw it up. We got a good thing going here. Don't screw it up. Of course, Mr. Hernandez takes his job very seriously. Now, I should point out, Mr. Hernandez knows Mr. Schaeffer only by face. I mean, he comes down a couple of times a year. He walks on the shoe factory floor. He talks to Mr. Schaeffer. Mr. Schaeffer, how are you doing? How's that young wife of yours? Oh, you now have 8 children. Wow, you have been busy. You know, things like that. Every once in a while, Mr. Hernandez will maybe give Mr. Schaeffer a little bit of increase in pay, that kind of thing. There is a relationship between Mr. Schaeffer and Mr. Hernandez, but let's just point out for what it is. It's kind of a boss-employee relationship, and that's all that it is. For example, Mr. Hernandez lives in a completely different place than does Mr. Schaeffer. Mr. Schaeffer lives in a place where people who work on a shoe factory floor have to live. Mr. Hernandez lives next to the country club, if you get my drift. In other words, he comes from bank. He's always come from bank. He knows what it is to have money that Mr. Schaeffer not only doesn't know, but Mr. Schaeffer understands he will never know. In other words, they live in 2 different worlds entirely. And yet, Mr. Hernandez has always been a good boss to Mr. Schaeffer. In fact, one time when Mr. Schaeffer got very ill, Mr. Hernandez did not fire him from his job and let him stay at home for a couple of extra days to get well. So that relationship is intact. What Mr. Schaeffer doesn't know is that 2 weeks before his name ended up on that list, Mr. Hernandez was sitting in his office, working away, balancing the figures, when busting through the door stepped Mr. Logan. Mr. Logan is not British. Mr. Logan is American. And he comes walking in, well-dressed, expensive suit, briefcase in his hand, and he pushes the door open uninvited and just walks into Mr. Hernandez's room and says, greetings, I don't have much time. You're going to listen to what I got to sell you. You'll either decide to buy it or you won't. I'm Mr. Logan from Boston, and we got a machine. This machine is something else. It makes shoes. You're going to love it because it does the work of 100 workers, and it runs all the time. You can cut your labor force in half immediately. You can make more shoes faster with my machine. Of course, here's the deal. It's all right if you decide you don't want to buy my machine, because I'm going to go down the street 200 yards to your competitor, the factory owned by Mr. Beck, and I've already talked to him and he's going to buy 2 of my machines. So you make the decision. Ready, go. Well, let's point out a couple of things. We know how this story ends because we know what happens to Mr. Schaeffer that morning he got up and went to that shoe factory. And he's standing outside of the door of that shoe factory with his name on that list, which tells him Mr. Hernandez made his decision. Mr. Hernandez made his decision in regards to Mr. Logan. As Mr. Logan says to him before he leaves, you need to hurry up and sign these papers because I got a boat to catch. I got to get on a boat. You probably heard of it. It's called the Titanic, and I'm about ready to go back to New York. Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. That, by the way, was a joke. Yeah, okay, that was a joke. Thank you. Okay, there's my story. And it's a silly story. But it does some important work for us in regards to now answering the question, what was the Industrial Revolution? Now you can pick up your pens, and we're ready to go to work. If you understand anything about the story that I just played out for you, there's a couple of key players, and there's a couple of key things to be noticed. Let's take them one at a time. Let's start with who I started with, Mr. Schaeffer. Now, if you can at all crawl inside of his experience and have some sense of what's going on with his experience, it's pretty cut and straightforward. One morning he wakes up, just like he's always woke up. He goes to a shoe factory where he's worked all his life pretty much, only now he ain't got no job. What does he, again, you're writing. What are the first thoughts that go through his mind? Okay? I want you to try and think about this for a moment. What are the first thoughts that go through his mind? See, I'm going to work with this model now for a while, and I'm going to point out some things to you that you ain't going to learn on no worksheet. You're going to have to think through it now. And the first question for you is, what goes through Schaeff's mind as he's standing there at the door with his name on the list? Oh, I'm sorry. By the way, we're talking about a time in history when Schaeff can't go out and get himself no lawyer and sue Mr. Hernandez. Can't do it. Can't do it. Also, Hernandez is not under any obligation of law to pay him any kind of severance benefits of any kind. None. Zero. Schaeff has no federal program of any kind that can help him, for example, to pay him money, to pay for food, to pay for clothing for his children. Nothing. Zero. He lives in a time where those programs do not exist at all. In other words, when Schaeffer's name is on that list, it's over. It's done. He will never see Hernandez again in his life. He will never be able to ask Hernandez, dude, what, really? What, was I doing something bad on the floor? Nothing. The story I told you about Hernandez and Logan, you know Schaeffer will never know. Ever. Ever. It isn't going to end up in some newspaper story. There isn't going to be some undercover TV show, 2020, that will explain how Schaeff got jacked. None of it. He just doesn't have a job anymore. It's done. It's over. One obvious thought is, I've been doing shoe factory work a long time. It ain't no big thing. Dude, I'll just go down the street to Mr. Beck's factory. I know he's been down there. And in fact, once, long ago, a representative from Beck's factory actually approached me and said, you can make more money working in my factory. But I said, no, I got loyalty to Mr. Hernandez and to his father and his grandfather. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stay at that factory. So he turns around and he goes down the street to Mr. Beck's factory. The only problem is Mr. Beck's got a list twice as long of people he's laid off from Mr. Beck's shoe factory. Obviously, Mr. Logan got to Mr. Beck as well. Again, Schaeff's got no idea why all these names are on his shoe factory list. He just knows he ain't got no job in his shoe factory, which means in the end, after he goes to Beck's factory, he's going to have to walk home. He's got to walk through the door, and he's got to tell his wife, Miss Barnard, and there ain't kids, I got no job in his shoe factory. I got no job. Again, write it down. What are the adjectives that come to mind right away in terms of the emotions, the way he's going to feel? You got any?
Horrible.
Horrible? Keep going. What are some other ways he's going to feel about this? He's going to go through a range of emotions, isn't he? First it's going to be what? Shock. Disbelief. Ain't no way. Dude, I've been working too long. I got too good a job. I am too important to not... Then it's going to move from shock to anger. Rage, we might even say. Would you agree? How could this happen to me? But after the rage, what's going to be the next emotion?
Sorrow.
It is, isn't it? All of a sudden, a certain level of anxiety, stress is going to come in. His children are waiting to be fed. Schaeff maybe has enough money saved up to last a week or two. But that's it, because he doesn't make that much anyway, right? He's already looking ahead to say, what do you do with 8 kids when you ain't got no job? Now, all of a sudden, where's it going to go? Oh yeah, huge for you to understand. There ain't no Big Mac for him to go get a job at. There is no fast food place for him to go get a job at. He does the job he learned growing up from his father. He never went to school. He didn't need school. Education. What's the point of education? I don't need to go to school. He may not even know much about reading and writing. He doesn't need to do that. He knows what he can do. He's done it all his life at a shoe factory. Question. Write in your notes. What will he say as he goes home to his 13-year-old son after he tells his 13-year-old boy, Daddy ain't got no job at a shoe factory anymore? what's he going to tell him that we can pretty much guarantee would be the thing he's going to say to his son about education? Go ahead, write it down. What's he going to say to his boy about education? What's Schaeffer going to say to his boy? I can't tell you about the future the way I thought I could before this morning. This morning I could have told you, don't worry about it, son. You'll have a job at a shoe factory. It ain't that big a deal. I've worked there. I'll get you a job there. It's not a big deal. Now all of a sudden, what's he going to say to his boy? The only thing I can tell you about the future is, I got no idea. And that means your only shot of making it is what? All of a sudden, an education means something quite different to Schaeffer's boy than it meant to Schaeffer. You got me? Schaeffer, for example, had the luxury, maybe, of going to school and seeing it as a joke. Yeah, all right, I'll do some, till I get old enough, I can go to work full-time in a shoe factory. What difference does it make? Not anymore. Not anymore. Now, all of a sudden, his 13-year-old boy, he's got to look at education a whole different way. How come? Write it down. What is the point about education? I don't get it. What are you talking about? Schaeffer lost his job at a shoe factory. What's that got to do with education? That's the only way that boy's going to have a chance to get a job so that he can get some money, so that he can get some F-O-O-D. See, it all comes down to the most fundamental issues, right? Right? What about Miss Barnard? See, we don't think about this one all the time. What about his wife? He goes home, he tells his wife, I ain't got no job. Think about what that means. By the way, let's get it out of the way real quickly. Miss Barnard doesn't have a job. She doesn't work anywhere outside of the home. Her job is to take care of the house, to take care of the children, and to wait for Mr. Schaeffer to come home. That is what she's always done. It's what her mother did. Think about the ways in which Miss Barnard's life just got turned upside down. For example, she may have to actually go outside and start looking for work anywhere, sweeping up a floor, doing whatever she can. Schaeff's kids might have to start going out and going to work. By the way, this is a time where there are no child labor laws, and when the first child labor law comes into action, they limit the number of hours for a 5-year-old to 12 hours a day. Can't make them work more than 12 hours a day. 5. Lots and lots of children under the age of 10 will die on work floors of exhaustion. That's why they put in the new law, can't make them work more than 12 hours. That's the time period we're talking about, folks. Would you agree with me? This is a different time period from the one you live in now. Or some of you will say, yeah, maybe. Maybe not so much. Right? Because I had students that came out of 303 that laughed at me when I said, you should think about going to school. Dude, what do I need to go to school for? I got a great job in the oil field. Right up until the what? Oil field shut down. Then what? Well, I'll go get another job in another oil field. Well, guess what? If one shoe factory closes, usually there's going to be a Logan visitor to another shoe factory. Are you hearing what I'm saying? If one oil field's going to shut down, usually another one's going to shut down too, huh? Which means more people without work. Which means now all of a sudden the only chance I got to get a job is education. The one thing I never thought mattered. Because I had a job making great money an hour, hourly wage. Right up until it didn't pay. See, we may be in the same time. But wait a minute, let's talk. See, we always have a tendency to think about Schaeffer and his wife and the kids. But I don't want to go there anymore. I want to talk about Hernandez for a few moments. Because sometimes we have a tendency to look at Hernandez and go, oh man, how can you be so cruel? But wait a minute. Hernandez is in a tough place, as is Mr. Beck. So let's try and think through their eyes for a moment or two on this project. Hernandez is sitting, doing his work, uninvited. Logue walks through the door. But wait a minute, I didn't say Logue was just anybody. I said he was from where? Now let's go ahead and play this game as 1850, shall we? We'll call it 1900 to make it even easier. All right? 1900. All right? So, what's the big deal about Logue being an American? Write that down. Who cares? Dude, why can't he come from Zimbabwe? What difference does it make when he comes from America? And notice, I didn't just say America. What city did I say? I said Boston for a point, too. We'll get to it in a moment. What's the big deal about him being an American? Who cares? Well, no, wait a minute. We know about this little thing called the American Revolutionary War. We studied about that when we were juniors. Oh, I'm sorry. That was a war fought between American colonialists and the British. And we kind of mark the important date of that war as being 1776. Tommy and his pals, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, blah, 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 blah. Remember? 1776, wait a minute, 1876 is 100 years later, and we said 1900, which is just a few days after that. Little over 100 years before, the British will have lost that war. And all of a sudden, America starts its climb. What kind of climb? An industrial climb. An economic climb. And the city that will support so much of that is Boston. Where? Constant innovations coming out of those factories. Logan shows up. Notice I said how he's dressed. How's he dressed? He ain't dressed in no poor man's suit. He walks in with a briefcase, and he doesn't have to be invited. He barges through the door of Hernandez's office and says, I got 5 minutes. You're going to do this or you're not. I really do not care. We know what Hernandez did because Schaeffer didn't get his job. What we don't know is what Hernandez went through that night when he had to make his decision. Because he told Logan, can you give me a day? And Logan said, I'm leaving tomorrow on the Titanic. You bet I'll give you a day. And that evening, Hernandez was laying in bed. And he was playing it out in his head. What are his options? They're simple, aren't they? One, he shows complete and total fidelity to Schaeffer and the rest of the guys, and he says, you're a lousy American scumbag, get out of my office. I'm going to run my shoe factory the way I want to run my shoe factory. I am not laying off Schaeffer and another 100 of his pals. No way. What's the problem with thinking that way, though? What does Hernandez know about Beck?
Competition.
That's it. It's all about competition. And if Mr. Beck has bought 2 of these machines, Hernandez is aware. It won't be long. And if I don't buy this machine, I'm not making enough shoes. I don't lay off Schaeffer and just a few of his pals. I got to lay them all off. And in the process, Hernandez loses the factory that his grandpa and his daddy told him, don't you lose this factory. But it goes deeper than that. I told you, Hernandez comes from a different class. He was educated at the top school. We'll call it Eton, the top Ivy League high school in all of England. He went on to Cambridge to take his degree. He has knowledge that Schaeffer does not have. He sees the world. He knows what's going on. What lies in the back of his mind when he realizes that Logan from Boston is the one coming through his door? It doesn't take him long to start putting the pieces together. Help me do it. Put it in your notes. It's like sticking Legos together. All of a sudden, Hernandez, he's figuring it out. Oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. If this cat can walk through my door and demand I buy that machine, he's the one making the machine, therefore he's the one making shoes. What? It won't be long before people in England will start buying shoes. Right. This is the beginning of Walmart. It's the way it happens. If you can get it cheaper at another place, that's where you go. What happens to the small businesses? They can't survive. In other words, Hernandez lies in his bed and he goes, all right, I'm going to buy this machine. I'm going to get this machine from the very guy who ultimately is going to gut me. Right? Of course, we don't stop there. Hernandez is smart enough to realize that if there's one Logan, there's 100 Logans. Right? There are businessmen. This can't be the only businessman out of Boston who has a special machine for shoes. And in a moment, watch my whiteboard. In a moment, we know something about the way nations rise and fall. Watch this. This comes from the great philosopher Plato, who said this about groups of people, namely nations. He says, you have a beginning, you have an ascension, and then you have that. Let's call the beginning A. Let's call the ascension B. But then all of a sudden there's this C. That moment when a culture starts to look collectively over its shoulder to a golden age, when things were a whole lot better. Think about Hernandez lying in bed that night trying to make this decision about whether he's going to go ahead and do this with Logan or not. He recognizes something, right? Would you agree with me? See, you wrote that down yesterday when I said the Industrial Revolution was all about change. It just hadn't hit your brain what that really meant. For Hernandez, he collectively, along with Beck, along with a whole lot of other businessmen, will say, uh-oh, This ain't good. This ain't good. Something's up. In other words, why aren't English inventors and innovators arriving in Boston? Why does an American got to come here? It's over. Think of your history. When we did that timeline yesterday, we started with English history and Beowulf in the year 1000. Right? You wrote down on your paper that in our story of the shoe factory, we wrote down 1900. That is 900 years of history. That's a long time. Would you agree with me? The country you live in, that we consider so great, is barely 300 years old. That ain't nowhere close to 900 years. Would you agree with me? And that evening as Hernandez lies in his bed, it's got to go through his head. 900 years of history. Crap, what happened? What happened? And what's the future going to look like? See, they're both lying in beds that night. Right? Schaeffer's in his bed. Hernandez is in his bed. Beck is in his bed. They're all having the same feelings. But they're seeing it from totally different perspectives. For Schaeffer, it's simple. He lost his job. For Hernandez and Beck, it's a whole different project. Something's going on. What's going on? Why are these Americans showing up? Right? Of course, we have a tendency to kind of look at Logan as the last player in our story and go, seriously? But think about Logan. It isn't going to hit him, but it should. What should hit him? Lying in bed that night. Of course, he's happy, right? Man, I made bank. I'm going to get on the Titanic, best boat in the world. I'm going to be back in Boston in a day and a half. This is awesome. You laugh, huh? But if the boat had never sunk, he'd have made it back to Boston with serious bank. Lots of other guys are going to make it back. It never occurs to him that night lying in bed. What doesn't occur to him? Because he's an American and he's young, and his country is young, and it's dynamic and excited. What does not occur to Logan? Because where is Logan in our little map? And where is America in our little map? Right? Right? You guys were born when? 1995? There was an interview. The year 1990. There was an interview. That year, the top 5 cars in the world, best-selling cars in the world, list was made. And in the year 1990, 4 of the 5 cars were not made in the United States of America. The very place where cars were invented. 1, 2, 3, all from Japan. The Japanese Prime Minister, in an interview with New York Times reporter, was asked, can you explain the fact that the top 3 cars in the world are made in Japan, not in America? How do you explain that fact? America invented the car, invented the automobile. How do you explain that fact? The Prime Minister didn't even blink. He just laughed. He said, everybody knows that. We all know that in Japan. It's easy. New York Times reporter's like, what are you talking about easy? What do you mean? He said, it's very simple. The American labor force is fat and lazy. We, on the other hand, we know how to make a car. Well, bury them. The statistics are all there. That thing is published. Right about the time you were born. And guess what? Logan, of course, by this point is gone, isn't he? But guess what? Americans kind of know this in the very years that you were born, at the turn of the century. And the question begins again. What about the new technologies? And what about the culture at large? And what about the economics? Well, let's finish. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution. Final comments. It is a time period of dynamic change. Fundamental. Can we say it that way, Miss Barnard? Because it is fundamental. One day, you have a great life. And the next day, you do not know how you're going to take care of your children. That is a fundamental change. Would you agree with me? Because there's no solutions. There are no solutions. It's not like Miss Barnard says, oh, well, we can go do this, and it's okay. Don't worry, honey, we'll figure it out. Schaeffer will say the same thing. My life is ruined forever. And no matter what job I get, it's never going to be the same kind of job because I'm going to have to get some kind of other education. I'm old. For Schaeffer and for Barnard, their only hope is their children and what their education for their children can mean. All of a sudden, school really matters. It's funny how I give this lecture and sometimes some of my students go, now I understand why my great-grandma was so upset when I did not do well in school. Grandma, who cares? It's 8th grade. And she'd go off on me because she understood what that little drawing on a board looks like. She understood what it meant. An education might be the only chance a kid's got to make it out of poverty, for example. If you can't get a job, you can't buy bread. If you can't buy bread, you can't eat. You hearing me? You got it? It's that simple, right? The Industrial Revolution takes a time in England where everything seems to be kind of like celebrated as we are the best. And all of a sudden, with Logan showing up in Hernandez's office, self-doubt, cultural self-doubt, that's a term I would recommend you write down. Cultural self-doubt starts to build. And you increasingly find England and the English people beginning to doubt that they're going to make it to year 1000. At 900, maybe it's over. Maybe it's over. Now, of course, we know how this story ends, and it's an amazing story for the English people, right? We are in 2114, right? And here we are, right? Here we are, as we wrote on our board, huh? Right? Here we are. We're still here, right? And England is still around. But the Industrial Revolution is the beginning of the end, in many ways, of a certain kind of lifestyle, a certain kind of way of living one's life. Factories change radically, and the future then increasingly uncertain. Nobody knows anymore. This story explains why some of you as seniors live in houses where the adults you're responsible to long ago were talking to you about, it's got to be something, honey, more than playing video games and drinking Mountain Dew. You got to figure out, what are you going to do? That's code language for, how are you going to feed yourself? That's really what they're asking. Why would they ask a question like that? Because they're aware of what the Industrial Revolution meant. It's a time of great uncertainty economically. But wait a minute, we missed it. There's another one. Uncertainty, not just economically, not just culturally, but think about the relationship between Schaeffer and Miss Barnard. If she goes out and gets a job and he can't find a job, she's making more money than him. How's that going to change the relationship between them? For your notes, this is what we call the introduction to the gender wars. We're familiar with this in our own history, aren't we? To fight a war in the Second World War, lots and lots of guys had to leave and had to go fight a war. Who's going to run the factories? Lots of women. The only problem was what happens after the war's over and the men all come home. They want their jobs back. Women are not so easy to say, yeah, take your job back. I'll go back into the house and do what I used to do before. A shift occurs, doesn't it? And we're familiar from the 50s on how that gender war starts to happen in our culture called America, right? A lot of this is forecasted in the Industrial Revolution as well. Okay? When we come back tomorrow now, we'll start looking at a poet who spoke during this time and about this time. We'll start looking at as well some writers who started to kind of think about issues like marriage, for example. We'll talk about that tomorrow.